All right, welcome to Boundless and Bottomless Seas.
What's up, everybody?
Nothing much. We're on Chapter 5, Global Transition and its Enemies. But before that, I wanted to address a few things that have come up. One, I feel like the rise and fall of left Duginism has happened since we kind of started this series.
Yeah, I think so.
Weirdly, it's one of those things where their success made them rudely unpopular. By that I mean the American Communist Party absconding with maybe, depending on who you ask, some chapters of the CPUSA, consolidating Midwestern Marx, which had to eat a lot of its own positions to do this, and Hinkle and Haas into one very massive media operation that may or may not be an actual party. Seems to have actually turned most of the MLs against any lingering Duginism, and they've become much more suspicious of it than before. I know a lot of people who were very friendly to Midwestern Marx who are now freaked out by this stuff. So I find that interesting in and of itself. That maybe by the time we started this has already lived through its second life cycle as an attempt to convert the left, and people actually reading this shit, they're realizing what it is. But I also want to talk a little bit about some other stuff that's been brought up in the comments before we get into this. I've been mildly chastised for not going into the fact that Dugin is not just an Orthodox Christian, but a perennialist, and thus a radical traditionalist more. And that is because Dugin himself equivocates on whether or not he is still any form of radical traditionalist outside of Eastern Orthodoxy. And I have a hard time taking any of the claims that helps you read him seriously. Not that I don't think it's true, but that I've read many Dugin books at this point, like most of the ones available in English, and his books are radically different from book to book, just like his speeches are different from talk to talk. Like he doesn't.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I don't think that would change anything for me reading this. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not like a secret filter that makes things make more sense or less sense.
Would it be a pointless sidebar for you to define what perennialism is?
No, I can go into it. Perennialism is a theory that all religions ultimately are syncretically recognizing the truth of a perennial religion, which is either a religion nobody is a part of, or depending on what kind of traditionalist you are, your already existing religion.
Okay. That's kind of what Hegel's position it was.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Catholic perennialist, for example, which Hegel was not, but if you're a Catholic perennialist, you would say that like Hinduism still recognizes certain Christian truths because it's part of the truth of reality itself. But perennialism is assumed in Avola and Guénon, and in those weird mystical satanic things that Dugin was part of in his 20s and 30s, maybe even his 40s. But he has supposedly, even by the time of writing this book, become a good Orthodox Christian. Okay. I have pointed out that, well, only kind of can he be considered a good Orthodox Christian because some of the stuff is heretical. And I think people who want to correct me on the perennialism would have to deal with the fact that perennialism would be heretical in some form. Now, I would say there are Eastern Orthodox versions of like the cosmic Christ that would say like, oh, yeah, like there's recognitions of the truth of Christianity by accident in all these fallen heathen religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. But I don't think that's exactly what's going on here, because the perennialism would be the justification for why, for example, he doesn't have a problem with Islamism.
I mean, there's a slight version of that perennialism, which is ubiquitous, and it's only like officially not perennialist because of the influence of the Americanization of the post-industrial Protestant Second Reformation, whatever. I think if you were a perennialist, but you didn't really talk about it very much, you didn't really like define it too much, you would not be heretical in most sects of Christianity. But in some, especially the more rigid you are about how true that makes other religions, you might be a heretic for sure.
Yes, it's up to the patriarch, right?
I would say honestly, perennialism is an impulse that most Christian religions have because they claim because they actually claim that some of Christianity is rationally deductible, not just from revelation. So, so that they would say anybody who's spiritually seeking, even if they've never seen the light of Christ, could arrive to it. The problem that you have though is how far are you going to take that?
Well, right. That's the only actual question, but it's a big one.
Like if you're a Vola, what you're trying to do is like find the true Proto-Indo-European Ubermensch religion, and that is probably pagan. If you're Guanon, your first is like traditional Catholicism, but he ends up like tying Hinduism and Islam together. And Guanon is more, and French speakers, I'm going to butcher every name you guys have. Is more is less political than Avola, even less political than Spengler, which it's closer to, but it is still thoroughly anti-modern. The other correction was that people were saying we were taking Dugin's stuff on race too seriously, that he meant it as a metaphor, and to which I say, well, he could have just said it was a metaphor then.
Sure. Yeah, he hedges a lot in this book. He could have hedged on that. He hedged on fascism. He could have hedged on race.
My criticism, my overall criticism so far, is that in general, Dugin operates like as though he doesn't need to clarify anything. I think maybe you guys both made this point before, but he was trying to keep things open. I think Varn, you said it was to throw everything at everybody and just see what sticks. But I think in every chapter so far, basically every single concept, he could have defined it a little bit more and saved us a lot of trouble.
Right. Well, and I think he deliberately doesn't. Like, I think that's, I mean, I can't prove it, but I do feel like that's tactical. And I don't just feel like it that way off of this book. I feel like it's tactical after reading a ton of his stuff and realizing how contradictory they are. Like, I can't square stuff in other books necessarily with stuff in this one.
One thing that we can give him credit for and being honest about is, I think, a tendency that's probably recognizable to all three of us and many people too, which as a political philosopher, say what you want about the guy, his sort of ecumenical tastes and eclecticism seems to me to be this drive that he has to actually make like a new future possible, to like be doing politics, to create some sort of social basis for his political philosophy. And with that, casting a wide net seems to me to be an attempt to try to actually create a politics out of this.
Right. But it's a political myth. It's not a political analysis. Like, and I think this needs to be really dealt with, because you and I have talked about, well, he talks about liberalism as if liberalism does stuff, and we like can be really, really, really chastising and pretend like we don't know that he understands that. Not that liberalism exists as an egregore that does stuff, although sometimes he does seem to talk that way, quite frankly. But in general, we could steelman it and say, well, he's talking about the habitats that liberalism creates, but he removes all that from political economy, and he does so and not history. Just and history, and he does so not just on point of like avoiding it. It's actually a philosophical point for him that this is not based on political economy, that this is a larger source of meaning, and we're not really going to worry about that kind of stuff. Which I guess
it kind of makes sense if you're trying to make a case that being itself, that Dasein is a part of, like, that is an agent, that is a subject. And I guess it kind of makes sense you would also talk about the being in the under a system, and the way that liberalism is being, the way that fascism is being. That kind of makes sense to some degree, but I don't think it's not clarifying.
Well, it's interesting to me that he doesn't actually do that much with postmodernism, even though he uses it, because he's basically operating under like similar terminology. And I think it's important to point out that the Heideggerian assumptions that Dugin has were not uncommon, and in some places are still not uncommon on elements of the left. Not just on the Lacanian Althusserian left. Sorry, guys. There's all kinds of Heidegger that comes in through both Sartre and Kojève into Althusser, but also and through Lacan in particular. But also in the like Agamben, Nancy, post-socialism, Obabari, that stuff is also full of Heidegger. And I'm not saying that like Heidegger's like Nazi particles, it's just going to turn you evil. But I'm saying that like there's a reason why 10, 15 years ago, this probably would have not read that differently from a lot of stuff you read if you were reading continental left philosophy.
Yeah, new school shit.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we are kind of past that, although I'll be quite honest with you, all the Deleuzites and the Fischerites are not actually past that. Sorry, Mark Fisher fans.
No, I was going to say, I don't think we're as past that as maybe we think we are.
Right. And we might be returning to it as in the farce of a farce of a farce of history continues, where we see, instead of the DNC, which is going on as we speak right now, going the way of 1968 DNC, that like actually the protests are totally fucking up. They're not, and I don't mean in fucking up in the sense, oh, it's chaos like it was in 68. I mean, like they're not able to disrupt the functions of the DNC at all. They are ready for them. And it's actually making organizations like Frizzo look bad.
And making the Democratic Party look more unified than people had thought it might.
Right. And in fact, it looks like a good portion of the left is about to just liquidate itself into the Harris campaign, because that's what it really wanted to do anyway. And Joe Biden's senility was stopping them.
Right.
That's what, you know, that's where their true hearts lie. There's a lot of these radicalized people either want to be in meaningless sex, or they want to be in the Democratic Party. So
why not both?
Right. Or yeah, you could just kick it the old way and do both. And I think, you know, that doesn't seem relevant to this, but I think we have to ask ourselves, like, as we read this, why was this treated as so scary? I mean, you know, they did pull all these books from Amazon. You can still buy them in America. They're not banned in the formal sense, but like so many things, there did seem to be government pressure for Amazon to make it harder for you to procure them. And why? And that only seemed to actually make it sexier and spread faster on both the right and the left.
Right. Definitely.
Whereas now that it's being more formally articulated, and people who are no longer hiding the fact that they're Duginists, it's become a lot more unpalatable amongst people who were picking up. You know, there are all kinds of left-wingers talking about multipolarity in a Duginist way, not just in a general way.
Right.
Just 2 months ago, that are gone now. Like,
it was one thing. It was one thing to get it secondhand through like the Gray Zone or seeing news reports on Russia Today or whatever. It's another thing when it's a truly explicit political left tendency with a program and with a membership and certainly with a media project. Yeah, and one that keeps on weirdly finding itself in close proximity to actual Nazis. Yeah. And I don't say that to say that everyone in the ACP is a fascist. That's not my point. But there is constantly, since the ACP has come out, you know, the ACP haters have been able to dig up where, oh, this guy is related to this actual third positionist group. This guy is related to the actual national Bolshevik groups. And it's been really discrediting. As it should be. Which is why I think we should, this is, well, for people who wonder why I take an no platforming stance, even though I'm not often willing to have everybody and their mom on my show, is because I think a lot of times this stuff actually is a lot less sexy when you talk about it fucking openly. Right. But anyway, so
I think it's less sexy. It's also less dangerous. I think it's actually it's just thought provoking and also not very useful otherwise. But if you present it as something dark and mysterious, and it needs to be hidden away because it's dangerous, that makes it more attractive on the surface. But also, it makes, I don't know, like it makes the concepts seem deeper and richer than they are.
In a real sense, this project that the three of us are doing, for me anyways, is a continuation of the Antifada project we did of reading settlers. And not in the same way, because I don't, Jay Sakai isn't like Aleksandr Dugin. The two are not relatable, but you know, there's a way in which the settlers discourse, settler colonial discourse, has reached a real head now and attempted to become an explicitly universalizing critique for obvious reasons over the last 10 or 11 months. And I feel like reading Settlers was really helpful, if only for a small inoculation, or if only for like trying to understand the actual heart of the of Sakai's debate there. Try to take it seriously, try to take his history seriously, and understand why it is that this sort of stuff is so compelling. Or in the case of Dugin now, repellent, as you said, with the ACP.
Well, I think the ACP also like draws in tendencies that makes a lot of them look bad to each other. This is not to say it doesn't have a real, I mean, it's still growing. And I think some of the growth is real. But it's with these things that seem primarily based off of a few small organizations in the internet. And there's definitely money that people don't understand where it's coming from involved. Including the people receiving it, I've been told that it's hard to tell what's organic and what isn't. Is the ACP that, you know, it's definitely not the millions of people who supposedly followed Jackson Hinkle on Twitter. That's for fucking sure. But is it a sect of several thousand, or is it a sect of several hundred? We don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the other sects are dying right now. I mean, the one thing we do know for certain is that by their own accounting, the DSA is hemorrhaging members like crazy. And today I saw someone say that an entire chapter of the YDSA just switched and joined the PSL, while the PSL itself was losing some notoriety for not being able to deal with the Frizzo best DNC counter response. So it's just we're in a weird time. And it seems like already stuff that was hot and heavy when we started this series have become like weird fever dreams that have already passed.
Well, maybe they could be weird fever dreams passing again by the time we finish.
Because, you know, I mean,
everything has a very short life cycle these days.
That's the internet, right? That is the pundit sphere. That is,
Well, it's interesting because I think we everything has a very short life cycle, but it also keeps coming back.
Right.
Like,
and not coalescing, except maybe in this case with the ACP, but by and large not coalescing.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think we're gonna see a lot. I mean, like, it's crazy to me. We're sitting here in August of 2024, and in October of 2023, right before the Palestinian-Israeli war broke out, we were talking about the big thing was the left victory at the DSA and how most of the Democrat adjacent parties seem to have left it. And now it seems like that's not actually the case at all. And the DSA is being dragged kicking and screaming in two different directions. And the membership seems largely confused. And I bring this up because I want to tie this in for a second for people just thought we're just left gossiping. The right is equally broken right now. More so, maybe. And this has been very clear in the last 6 weeks when we've seen Trump. Since the last time we recorded, it looked like Trump was on the top of the world. And now it seems like he's totally scattered and can't respond.
And the JD Vance pick was very similar to something you could see happening on the left, which is like an extremely online millennial type with like kind of inchoate politics, but representing some sort of dissident wing of the right. Ends up being, it seems, deeply unpopular among most even like conservative and Republican folks across the country, and seems, as we know now, weird to many people.
Right. Well, we could also very easily see, yeah, we could see this if, like, I mean, in another way, I think a lot of these people want to liquidate in the Harris campaign because they want a victory. And I also want to point out, despite the fact that Trump seems to be in a tailspin, he's still only 2 points behind in most polls. So it's like, it doesn't even matter what these people do or think anymore. Like, they could be total shit. It wouldn't change the way people are going to vote. Yeah. And I think that makes Dugin more interesting in that post neoconservatism and post even paleoconservatism, what has attracted people on the right is weird shit. It is the weird shit. Like I thought it was just leftists who were attracted to weird shit, because leftists are always like, read Moldbug, read, and I'm like, dude, we need to read some actual conservative intellectuals instead of all this like bizarro shit that just looks like what you do but on the other side. But then when you read, like, when you get to someone like Arun McIntyre or JD Vance, both of whom before COVID were standard fucking neoconservative Republicans. JD Vance was almost a fucking right-wing Democrat.
Yeah.
And who have in their political careers gotten more and more into the weirder shit. It tells you that there really is something to Dugin's point that these people are looking for something and they don't have it. But right. the answers they get to are so fucking bizarre and weird and non-fungible and not even particularly organic to their actual religious cultural positions and classes and whatever, that it can't stick either. It strikes people who even are like JD Vance. Like, if JD Vance was the JD Vance of that annoying fucking movie and that cloying book,
yeah, and
he hadn't spent as a senator spent years interacting with weird ass marginal movements on the internet, it would be like if we discovered that Kamala Harris had been secretly hanging out with communization theorists in a salon somewhere, which also, I will say, is not out of the realm of possibility.
No, all you would need was like a coterie of powerful technology capitalists in Silicon Valley to become communizers, and then there'd be like a venue for these ideas, and there could be like Democratic politicians that get into it. But I mean, that's the analogy to JD Vance and the right.
This is the reason I think that well, if I'm being very charitable, this is probably the reason why this book, and at least this particular variance of Dugin's thought, is somewhat ill-defined. When he's always talking about like needing to develop the fourth political theory, and if and when it takes shape, you know, it will look in some ways like this, because I think there's this recognition that nobody knows anything, and so everybody's just going to be very weird and grasp around in all directions for a long time.
I'm going to say something dialectically weird about Dugin's move here before we get into this chapter, and we can get into it. But I think there is a honest dishonesty in Dugin, which is a weird thing to say.
I think I agree with you, but now I want to know what you mean.
I think, for example, that he is throwing spaghetti at the wall, as we've already taken, and he knows that. And he is doing a lot of bait and switch here. There's a lot of bait and switch. We have to admit that. But then there's also these weird times where he just admits point blank that that's what he's doing. For example, the chapter on Marxism was like, we don't really like Marxism. We want Marxism to totally go away, but we can use it. And I'm just going to tell you flat out, we're going to fifth column it, and I'm going to say it extremely bluntly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a similar tactic to what makes Donald Trump appealing. It's like, I'm just saying what I'm doing. I'm saying it out loud. I'm not lying to you. And I think that makes people respect him more anyways.
Right. Everybody else is corrupt, but I'm the only one that'll actually say it.
Right. Well, here's the thing, though. I think you also, there's another way in which it's applicable, because Donald Trump is lying to you. Because if you listen to it, but I don't just mean that in the sense of like, oh, he doesn't really believe what he believes. I think he probably believes half the shit that comes out of his mouth. That's irrelevant. He literally can't believe everything he says. Like, I've said this now for 2 years. If you listen to a Trump speech, if you're a neoconservative reactionary, not one of the smarter ones who's already defected to the Democrats, but if you're like John Bolton, who wants, if you're a hyper-Zionist, if you're an anti-Semite, if you're a paleo-conservative, if you're a neo-reactionary, and if you're a beltway conservative of a certain kind, you can all agree with parts of what Trump says because he's contradicting himself.
Right. Yeah.
But he says it in such plain language that it's deceptive. Like, that you feel like you're listening to someone who is giving you straight up, but what he's actually doing is telling you exactly what you want to hear and knowing how to phrase it vaguely enough that it's a problem. And it's clear in something like the Project 2025, where it's not vague anymore, that it's a real problem.
That's right. He has to run away from it as soon as it hits the public consciousness.
Right. And it's not just because I think he secretly wants to do all that. I think he's really bothered by the fact, hey, you are limiting our ability to pivot by stating all this shit outright. I'm trying to be a workers' party and you want to destroy all the workers' rights. Now, I might let you do that, like, because, you know, Trump is not opposed to what the southern states are doing right now or whatever. But dear God, don't make it formal policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
And I think it's a Donnie Deals thing too, right? Like so much of his bluster and so much of his outright lying and playing both sides against the middle is, I think, in his mind, as he did when he was a businessman, successful or unsuccessful through the years, of opening up with a negotiating position and allowing yourself wiggle room to get in or out based on what the circumstances demand. And people see that as perfidy, and it is in a very real way. But it shouldn't be surprising coming from like an 80s real estate guy from New York.
but we should also see this is also his major weakness, that if he doesn't know who his opponent actually is, he can't do it well anymore. And we've seen that he's lost the plot since Biden's out of the way.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
It's really weird because all of a sudden the most successful and most popular and most appropriate political figure for these times seems as though he is extremely ill-suited to the times. Like, just like that, like all at once he just became ineffective.
Yeah. And that's despite having every, like, in some ways, that assassination attempt, even though it was more or less random, should have put him up to just walk on into the White House. And I was thinking that.
That's what I thought too.
Did you guys?
He's president now, yeah.
I watched the RNC, and the first 10-15 minutes of his speech was absolutely riveting, and it was like presidential type presidential type address, like acknowledging how close he came to being assassinated and being murdered, being humble, being struck by this event that happens to him, and then he immediately goes into an hour of just rambling bullshit, which just goes to show how little has changed.
Well, that was the thing about it, is when you watch the RNC, it was like you saw him come from power to decline in his own speech in an hour and a half. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting. And I was thinking about that to tie this into the book, so we can finally get started on this. But I was thinking about that about this book. If Dugin got what he wanted, and there was and I'm not even, like, I'm going to say this, I'm not even sure it would be necessarily bad, despite how conservative the Russia really is as a society right now. And I don't want to come out on Russians, but the Russian government is not a progressive by any standard. It's just not, it's just opposing an imperialist that's worse. If the geopolitical situation, if Putin got what he says he wanted, right? And I believe that I don't think he's lying here, to get a less hostile view from the United States, it actually broke up NATO. What the fuck would Dugin have on offer? Because Dugin's offer is only palatable in its vagueness if you have the United States as a representative of liberalism kicking people around.
Right.
And I think that's something that's interesting about the times, and that's very true here. And
I mean, that's why well, that's why I often will make some reference to the fact that reason is very cunning. Like if Putin is unsuccessful, then the world is the way it was already, which is bad. And if he is successful, it's at least different, and also it's bad in other ways. But somebody has to do something, and it seems as though what's happening is I don't want to say Putin is like, I want to back away from that. I don't want to say that Putin is like enacting the will of history. What I'm saying is that
well, I mean, here's the problem with that. Russia has benefited from decoupling, and China's issues, both good and bad, have been accelerated by decoupling. But you know who started the decoupling? The United States. It was not them. And it leads to this weird paradox that you see on the anti-imperialist left a lot, where on one hand, everyone wants us to end sanctions, and on the other hand, the people that they're celebrating are able to resist the United States because they're sanctioned and cannot participate in the global economic order.
Yeah.
And that paradox seems to be beyond people. I'm not saying it's an irreconcilable paradox. It's not an irreconcilable contradiction that you would say that.
No, but it's not being checked. It's a process in motion without any breaks. Yeah.
In order to reconcile it, you'd have to have a more advanced theory than either like America bad or the CIA does everything. You'd have to have something that synthesizes those two things. And I think that's possible.
My favorite thing right now, and I'm not even going to say it's totally out of the question, but I know a lot of people who are now responding to this Duginism stuff are basically implying not that he's a creature of the FSB, but he's a creature of the CIA. Which would be hilarious to me. I mean, if it's true, it would be hilarious.
That would be really cool. Get those archives out there, man. I want to see it.
But that also seems to me like this weird sort of like view that nothing bad can ever happen unless the United States intelligence agencies do it.
Right.
So it's a very strange view of the world, but
not a common one. More and more, it seems.
Well, I mean.
Both left and right.
Yeah, the left
it's the CIA, right? It's FBI.
Right. Well, also like the return to left conspiracism is actually a sign that the left worldview is degenerating. And I know that's going to make people really uncomfortable, but when you have
it probably should though.
When you have to explain everything by shadowy actors when dealing with systems that are somehow both incompetent and the most competent organizations that have ever existed in the world of history, you are actually just losing.
Right.
Like but what is interesting is that's now something on both sides of the anti-systemic politics, both left and right, is that they're back into people should have been actually surprised when Tucker Carlson is totally buddy with fucking Alex Jones. That actually is indicating how much things have degenerated for them. And so there we go. Okay, now we're 30 minutes in and we haven't actually talked about the text, so let's talk about the fucking text. The world order question. So the new world order, this is where you get both anti-imperialist analysis and flat out Alex Jones shit in the same chapter.
Let's go.
So the New World Order, the NWO, I like how that's said as if that's like an organization, like the NWO, like the IMF and the.
Well, the funny thing is that the NWO is a thing. It's a wrestling.
Yes.
It's also a ministry song where they cut the clip of George H.W. Bush saying a new world order, and they put it over some weird noisy industrial shit. I'm really dating myself. That was like 1993.
Right.
I was in the 3rd grade.
Was a concept that was popularized at a concrete historical moment. I mean, I'm giving this shit for treating the NWO as a real thing, but I think this is a true statement. Namely, the Cold War ended in the late 1980s. And genuine global cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union was considered not only possible, but very probable. The basis of the NWO was presumably a product of convergent theories predicting the synthesis of Soviet socialist and Western capitalist political forms and a close cooperation of the Soviet Union and USA in the case of relational issues. For example, in the First Gulf War beginning in 1991. However, the Soviet Union collapsed soon after this, and the project of the NWO was naturally set aside and forgotten. See, that's an interesting reading of the New World Order, because most people read the New World Order as American hegemony.
Yeah,
But it actually does feel like Bush is actually that Dugin's actually more on to what Bush was talking about in the late 80s.
Yeah, I think if you spend a lot of time like reading about the negotiations and relationships between the U.S. government and under Bush and the Soviet government under Gorbachev, I think this is more accurate for sure.
Right, me too.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out the other, certainly in the 90s, sort of strain of New World Orderism, which were right-wing conspiracy theories of black UN helicopters and FEMA sites, really like this like post-Bircherites sort of anticipation. Alex Jones shit.
Yeah, the first iteration of Alex Jones. Yeah,
anticipating, what 3-4 years ago, all of a sudden everybody on the right was talking about globalism, right? I mean, that's what I think of because I was a denizen of the weird parts of the internet in the 1990s. That's what I would think of as NW.
When I started seeing mainstream pundits on Fox News talk about globalism, I knew that Alex Jones in some way had both failed and won simultaneously.
Failed to keep the narrative, but it succeeded in pushing it.
Yep, exactly. And that the Birchers had actually been vindicated by their failure into a success. Anyway, but I think this is interesting because basically the end of history is here, of course, because Fukuyama is someone that Dugin both knows but continuously misrepresents because he calls the end of history utopian here. And I'm like, and what did you read the same fucking book as me? Like,
what's funny is I don't, other than you, I don't know if anybody else talks about Fukuyama in that way. Well, yeah, I think that's why. Because from the left and also increasingly people on the right seem to have talked about Fukuyama as a proponent of what he was describing.
Right.
And that makes a difference.
Yeah, he thought it was going to win because it was the most logical way to deal with individuals and individual association. But he's a Hegelian. Fukuyama is a right-wing liberal Hegelian.
Yeah.
And the context of Fukuyama, at least as I remember it, again, I'm going into the past here, was you were either a Samuel Huntington, like the end of the Cold War was going to be a clash of civilizations, or you were like a Fukuyama.
Those were the two kinds of neoconservatism,
right?
Basically.
Yeah.
In the Fukuyama view, this is what's interesting. It's in the fucking title that people don't receive the second half of the goddamn title.
And the last man.
And the last man. Fukuyama is also saying Nietzsche was right about the spiritual desolation this will lead to. And it will lead to constant attempts to overcome the end of history, but they won't be able to because it's of limited appeal to individuals. That's part of the argument. And this will lead you to like 90s era Japan, where like people just start like opting out of shit and not working and like that's what he thought, which it is neither a utopian nor a dystopian vision, and I don't think it's ultimately correct. But I will also say, for all the history has restarted shit, nothing has replaced that form of liberalism that he's describing,
right? Which
is basically atomized individual right.
I mean, all the returns of history really just are vindications of Fukuyama's thesis so far, anyways.
Yeah, and I've said like you have to read Fukuyama as kind of dark Hegel. That like Hegel was right in the philosophy of right, but it's actually kind of bad. Like that it doesn't actually end up in freedom. That is that freedom doesn't end up free. And I think interestingly, Dugin would agree with that, but he's not going to say that because you can't just kick on Fukuyama. And we have to remember also, like Fukuyama was seen as this manifestation of the hubris of the Bush administration and the aughts.
Yeah.
Even though he himself had defected from all that, he was one of the first neoconservatives to become
anti-Iraq.
He turned against the rest of his colleagues. He became kind of a Democrat. fuck, man, he's even talked about the necessity of the DSA doing shit, and like,
well, I mean, I think
Keynesian social democracy being good. Like,
yeah, Fukuyama has even gone as far as saying some form of democratic socialism is probably necessary.
Right. Right.
Which, know, if it's just really vaguely Keynesian liberalism, but it's there's more to it for sure. Especially like I checked out one of his books while we were talking. I'm gonna do another one.
Nice. Multitasking.
Right.
Hell yeah.
I actually like Fukuyama's 2 long books, even though I don't agree with all of them in there. The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay, which is those 2 books are really good. This world order ignored all the other poles of power except the U.S. and its allies, including Western Europe and Japan. It did ignore China. It did not.
No, yeah.
And what other poles of power were there? Like you're gonna tell me that Russia was a pole of power in 1993?
Yeah, that's ludicrous, and I don't think he would say that. It's just yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it was conceived as a universalization of free market economics, political democracy, and the ideology of human rights. That's not what he actually argues. All of which were assumed to be a part of a global system and would be accepted by all countries in the world. He does argue that, but he doesn't argue that the former happens. He argues that atomized individualism is why it's going to happen. Like,
yeah.
Skeptics thought that this was rather illusionary and that the differences between countries and peoples would reappear in other forms. For example, in Samuel Huntington's emphasis crash of civilization thesis are in the ethnic and religious conflicts. Some experts, in particular John Mearsheimer, of course,
popular man nowadays,
regarded unipolarity not as a proper world order, but rather as a unipolar momentum, which was always true. I mean, but again, the end of history wasn't about polarity. It wasn't about one nation's political dominance.
Right.
So he's straw manning Fukuyama, really. If he's read the,
everybody straws it, but he's really straw manning it. Yeah. But it's interesting because he's positing, like, when most people refer to the New World Order, they're actually thinking about either the Alex Jones shit or they're thinking about unipolarity under the United States. And that wasn't what it was. The New World Order was supposed to be about a new, more cooperative, bipolar world.
Yeah. Like, the peace dividend and unbiased international institutions arbitrating between the conflicting interests of nation states with their own sovereignty and competitive advantage and all that shit.
Right. And by the way, like, all this talk on the left of like respecting sovereignty as somehow anti-imperialism, like, fuck you, man. That has like nothing to do with what Marxists meant by imperialism at all. Like, national sovereignty is inherently the worst form of class collaborationism.
Big time. Yeah. And yet we're stuck in it. That's something that's struck me lately, is that apparently the map in like 1991 needs to remain the same in perpetuum. Like, talk about like an abrogation and liquidation of politics in general. The idea that you could have a new polity, whether it's like the Donbass or whether it's like breakaway regions, or that peoples could come together and form some new sovereignty, is like completely verboten. And that's a lot of what I think is causing a crisis right now. But that's a sidebar.
Well, I mean, what is it? The hour of Minerva shits itself at dawn or whatever? No,
that's more or less right. Yeah.
No, there is a way in which people are doubling down on nationalism, both on the left and on the right. And on the left, it was not obvious until very recently. It was subtle. At the moment, it's the least viable, because it's very clear that national elites in any of these countries are barely holding on. And it is true that like the besieged powers are doing better than the unbesieged ones. Their internal contradictions are being stalled out by the fact that they're being besieged. And I don't just mean that in terms of like, you know, Russia and China. China's having some real problems right now. It is true that, like, when we compare, for example, the way the news reports uptick in Britain versus a downtick in China, that you're dealing with a 4% GDP growth versus like 0.2 GDP growth. It's still like the people who are like, oh, that's a conspiracy. It's not fair, but also like there's a bigger fall for China. People forget, but only 15 years ago, we expected like people were
13%, 15%,
right?
Yeah,
GDP growth like, forever.
Yeah,
and I'm like, now it looks like a lot more like the standard, mature middle income trap economy.
Yeah.
And although it has a lot more organic composition to deal with in the United States, as opposed to our GDP growth, which mostly seems to have been AI bullshit.
A magnificent 7, right?
Right. Well, it's because like old school industrialization will not produce a GDP growth that it did in the early 20th century anywhere on Earth. Yeah. We are beyond that now. So this is interesting, though. The Westphalian system no longer corresponds to the global balance of powers. New actors of transnational and subnational scale are affirming their growing importance. And it's evident that the world is in need of a new paradigm of international relations. At the time, people can go back to the aughts, because there are parts where this book is really dated. He's talking about like terrorist actors and non-state actors becoming more important. It is, right. And that's why the Westphalian system isn't working as well. By the way, the Westphalian system is just a system of fucking nation states.
Yeah.
Which Dugin wants for Europe, but nobody else. Which I've pointed out before, and I find suspicious. That I find I am like, oh, so you want Europe broken up into small nations, and it's very close to you, but everyone else should be in civilizational blocks. Why would that be? What cynical polarity stuff would lead me to think that maybe you're trying to pull a stunt there? But anyway, because I've actually read, Morgenthau and Carr and the founders of polarity, geopolitics, and realize what they're on about. All right. Anyway, so is Mearsheimer, by the way. If people think Mearsheimer's an anti-imperialist, listen to him talk about fucking China.
Yeah, seriously.
Right. Yeah.
He's an opposition. Right. He's like opposition figure within the blob, like an alternate State Department in waiting.
Well, basically, he thinks we should reconcile with Russia so we can nuke China and start World War III, but with Russia on our side. That's his actual state of politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Therefore, the contemporary world today cannot be regarded as a properly realized NWO. There's no definitive world order of any kind. We instead have a transition from a world order we knew in the 20th century to some other paradigm, which features are yet to be fully defined. Will the future really be global, or will regionalist tendencies dominate? Both. But, I mean, the fact that these people just try to pretend that you can run an economy totally internally to itself is weird to me. But that is a delusion that is not just on the right these days. I mean, there are MMTers who basically believe it too. And
I mean, that's basically the economic vision for the populist turn in the last 20 years of the left in Europe is basically that. It's like
which we can
autarky with cooperation.
Yeah, which is fucking stupid.
Yeah.
Literally impossible under a capitalist global society.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There was a period in which the USSR did that, but it was because it was in opposition to capitalism.
Yeah,
that was the whole point.
And as Bordiga, who not a guy I always loved, but he called this correctly, said that would not be maintainable for very long. They would have to open the doors to trade with the West, and that would be their downfall, which it was.
Yeah.
More than the Cold War was the fact that they needed fucking US and European dollars to bit the raw materials for their bombs. Just want to point that out. So when people are like, oh, the imperialists, they destroyed it. And I'm like, yeah, what do you fucking think was going to happen, you fucking moron? Jesus, I mean, did you guys read Marx and thought, and think that the capitalist powers were just going to let you do that? you're lucky that they didn't nuke you because they sure as fuck wanted to.
Many of them thought about it. That's for sure.
They almost did a couple of times.
Curtis LeMay, fucking Douglas MacArthur.
I was gonna say Douglas MacArthur was certain that we were going to.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just the fact that they get all foxy and sneaky about it shouldn't surprise you at all, and you should have been prepared. Like it's such a weird argument. Like it would be like if I was crying that like China was defeating the U.S. on the market and national competition on the international market because, you know, I was upset about it, and that's not what nations have to do to get relative organic capital to their people or whatever, even whether they're, you know, whether they claim to be capitalist or not. So anyway, the world order from the American point of view. All right. So the position of the United States during a shift is absolutely sure, but its long-term future is under question. Duh. Here's the thing. It's been obvious since the moment of unipolarity in the mid-90s that it was precarious as fuck. Like, and that as soon as we got it, we ignored its precarity and ruined it. I don't like that's been obvious to me my entire adult life. Like
that's what 2003 was about.
Which is why I'm always like laughing at people who talk about like American imperial rule and third worldism, because they're like, well, they bought off the proletariat. Oh, like during Fordism? Okay. But you know, in the height of the American power, I'm like, the height of American power is the high point of neoliberalism where they stopped doing that. So I don't even understand what you think you're describing. But it seems to be just something that you've got stuck in your head from reading, I don't know, Amir Samin once, and not really understanding that it doesn't correspond to the time periods at all.
Like you could be forgiven in 1964 for arguing something like that, but by 1984. If you still argue that, you basically just were like not paying attention to the world. And now it's more than just laughable. It's very well, it's
suspect. Unacceptable and
it's
suspect.
Unacceptable and suspect. Yeah,
I would say it indicates that you just don't like American workers, and that you're probably a person who both complains about the PMC and is one.
Right. And I get why you know there's a lot of frustration about the fact that things are bad, and yet the backlash is not obviously brewing anyway. So like, what's the deal? But I think it's just you have to look in a different direction than in the direction that leads you to say that they're bought off. Like, American workers are not bought off. There's maybe some other factors, but not bought off. In fact, that's what the discourse about spectacle is still interesting in that regard. For that reason.
So let's get to the order from American point of view. The creation of American empire, stricto sensu, was consolidated and technically socially developed central area and imperial core, with the periphery kept divided and fragmented and state of permanent unrest, bordering chaos. The neoconservatives, it seemed, were in favor of such a pattern. Absolutely. Yeah. The creation of a multilateral unipolarity where the U.S. would cooperate with other friendly allies, Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, Israel, Arab allies, and possibly other countries, Brazil, India. Actually, by the way, the U.S. has no problem being nice to India. Just want to point that out. And solving regional problems and putting pressure on rogue states such as Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, and North Korea. People who are what do all those states share? They've been sanctioned to shit.
Yeah.
Are preventing other powers from achieving regional independence and hegemony, China, Russia. Bullshit. We tried to really stop China from building hegemony until
we did a shit job, huh?
We didn't try until the Obama administration.
We didn't try until the horse had left the barn, man.
Well, I mean,
with all our capital.
Rhetorically, like, you know, one could say that we were trying. We should
really.
You know, yeah, there were some people who would, you know, they would raise a fuss
in the aughts.
Yeah,
well, in a weird sense, if
when
you
they had favored nation status.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying that there's any material backing to this rhetoric. I'm just saying that there have been people talking about China, in the you know, You go watch
Samuel
C-SPAN.
Huntington actually was one of the people who thought that the major two civilizational crashes would be us in China and us in the Islamic world.
I mean, don't forget what the thesis of the transatlantic ruling class was that with economic liberalization, China would be brought into the concert of nations. It would have a political revolution and become like a normal liberal democratic nation like the rest of them.
Right.
So not hegemonic on the terms that it's hegemonic right now. Instead, like a partner in unipolar.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It did try to see them as not setting up, but the thing is, we don't want anybody to set up an alternative. Like, we don't want fucking Israel to set up an alternative. Like, and they kind of have. So anyway, the promotion of accelerated globalization with the creation of a world government see, this is the Alex Jones shit. Very few people in the United States really do want this. I mean, you want to get people really upset, you start talking about world government, and the U.S. in particular is where that is unpopular.
Yeah, because the United States is essentially the world government.
Well,
people get so mad about it because it's the core. It's the core of the core.
Like, the IMF gets mad at U.S. sovereignty claims. Like, you gotta remember that. Like, the promotion of an accelerated globalization with the creation of a world government and a swift desovereign of nation states in favor of a United States of the world ruled by a global elite on legal terms. CFR project represented the strategy of George Soros and his foundations.
Wow, he really anticipated a lot of the politics of today, didn't he?
Yeah, well, he's where a lot of these people got it from. The color revolutions, although, again, this George Soros complaints were Alex Jones said back in that day. The color and not that George Soros doesn't pull stunts. I want to
that's true.
The color revolutions are viewed here as mostly effective weapons of destabilizing and finally destroying states. This view is also very common on the U.S. left, which is weird to me because basically it treats all internal political instability as really an attempt to fuck with other people's national sovereignty. And again, why do we give a shit about national sovereignty?
Also, Dugin's making a strong claim here that it's about destabilizing and destroying states. No, I mean, to the extent that there is influence on the part of the United States and the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, it's not to destroy states. It's to bring them closer to the extent that they can be into the orbit, of the United States.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing: the United States.
That seems like destruction if you're a Putinist, of course. But
right. But
the thing is, I think that this is
the
problem that I see with Dugin, anyways, is that he's looking for like an overarching theme. Like, this is what this civilization is trying to do. But really, if you're taking it very seriously, liberalism being dominant just means what they're trying to do is given. It changes from year to year and from location to location. Destroying states sometimes, and consolidating them in other times, depending on whether that's profitable right now. That's it.
And honestly, his work on land versus sea powers is weirdly more honest about this than this is. To be completely frank. Anyway. The U.S. seems to be promoting simultaneously all three strategies at the same time as part of a multi-vector foreign policy. The three strategic directions of the USA create a global context in international relations. So this is what Dugin doesn't fucking see because he's not capable of fucking seeing it, is those three strategies represent different parts of power classes in the United States who have radically different interests.
Yes.
And since he doesn't like talking about class interests because that messes up his mystical vision of organic unity that he needs for the Ruski Mir to also be organically unified.
See, that's why I'm a proponent of both the mystical vision and class interests at the same time.
Oh no! Did you join the ACP?
Don't give my.
I don't think I even know what that stands for.
American Communist Party.
Oh yeah, I definitely would never do that.
So, in any case, the U.S. is interested in affirming its strategic, economic, and political domination, aka like all hegemonic powers are interested in doing.
Yeah,
right,
including Russia.
Yeah, Absolutely.
And I'm not, this is not me like being like, Russia. I mean, like, that's what states do. When you read the polarity work, including by Mearsheimer, but all of them, Mergenthal, they're all like, this is what states do. Like, it's a Hobbesian state of nature claim.
Yeah.
Like, you can do it liberally, or you can do it, you know, to use the Machiavelli / Pareto metaphor, you can do it like a lion, or you can do it like a fox, but you're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, this is what's frustrating about this is there's definitely truth to parts of this for real.
You know what? That goes back to Machiavelli, even.
Yeah, I know. Pareto and Machiavelli, the rule versus the. People have been getting it because it's a big part of the elite school. So everyone's not, you know, all the conservatives are reading their proto-fascist again. And not admitting that's what they're doing. So it's and there is a sense in which I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that liberal power has like way leaned on the development of fox power, not lion power, and that like even the United States military doesn't seem that interested in being a fucking like military, but more like a way to make money. But nonetheless, look, I'm not saying that even that although I'm like, you know, there are more than two kinds of power. Like, what about wolves and bears? Like, you know,
the kind that hibernates for a long time and then
comes up and then bites your throat, or like, or I don't know, like wolves who are not foxes, but they work together and dismantle you. Yeah, wolves are my favorite force of power. Like,
we're gonna rewrite Animal Farm here.
You know, if we're gonna go on like weird predatory mammal metaphors, I got some better ones to add.
And there are wasps also.
Yeah, fuck those guys.
Yeah, I agree. Fuck a wasp.
Yeah.
Although really hating a wasp seems so like out of date now. Like they still exist, and they're still kind of in charge of everything, but like barely. The wasp realized the only way to survive was to self-abolish.
Communizers.
Hence the beginning of woke. No, God, if I was going to be a right-wing grifter, I just came up with a good one right there.
You did.
Yeah,
dude. You can make a whole fucking career off of that. See how easy it is, folks?
We'll make a new podcast and we'll all like wear masks and we'll like use voice modulators. And we'll do right-wing talk.
Like if I ever lose my day job,
it does make more money.
I make union rates, so I don't know about that. I feel like a lot of this like grifter economy is like,
it's drying up. It's drying up very fast.
And even at its height, it wasn't even close to like a union package where you have a retirement and shit.
I have told people, funnily enough, as a barely unionized public employee on the lower end of the pay scale of the public employee world, that I still do better than most podcasters. Not the biggest ones who are millionaires, but like most of them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like it's kind of sad. Anyways, where were we? Well, I was just saying that like this vision that he's talking about, he's mystifying the fact that he's right that like there's some people who want a new world order. There are the Zoroses of the world don't have as much power as the right gives them, but they are real. Sure. And they're not like the IMF really kind of does want like a deteriorized nation state because it would make a lot of things easier. We just had universal regulations. Fuck it, we could predict things. Then you have like, I mean, I do think there's some truth to the friendly powers version of soft power of like the Democrats, which is still, if you get uppity, they'll bomb the shit out of you. And there is truth to like the New American Century Project, which is dead. Like what's interesting about that is that vision of American unipolarity is dead, and yet it's still what's happening. So like no one advocates that anymore. No one thinks that's good. Like Mearsheimer or Peter Zion, they're both different kinds of realists. They don't think that shit's good.
And yet it's migrated to the very center of like state power and administrative state power in the United States.
1 and 2 are the same thing now.
Right.
You can thank Obama for that, actually, for tying those two together. Because on some level, it is like, oh, we'll have an imperial core, but we'll be like really, we'll have good relations with our allies, and we'll not directly go to war with China, but we're going to make things hard for them. Whereas, someone like me is just like, just fucking recognize that you have an equal in power now, or will be, because like, just deal with it. That
was an intentional thing in my mind, but
right. And that we also have like real big problems coming down that none of these nation states can deal with by themselves. I mean, this is another thing that Dugin doesn't want to look at all, which is like, what's going to happen when you have real resource constraints and this shit isn't working anymore, and there's mass movements of population from the quote developing world to the developed world, including Russia, and that's destabilizing everything because there's no clear ethnic identity. How the fuck are you going to build a Ruski Mir? And I think actually Dugin's pluralism is because part of him does realize that's a problem.
Yeah.
But his tendency to want to build the Ruski Mir is also like a contradictory tendency in himself. So it's.
I mean, I think if he were just to come out and say, "This is what's happening, so we have to embrace it," would make him seem kind of like a fatalist, and it's not. There's nothing vital about that. It's nothing bold and visionary. So I think you have to acknowledge it, but then say, yeah, but really this other thing which is not happening, but that's what we want to happen.
Right. Well, this is the thing where he's such a vitalist volunteerist, like and here's the thing about those of us who are deterministic, and I'm not a hard determinist, I'm a soft determinist, but I do think we have to be determinist as good materialist and or Marxist. Is that will matters, but there's real material limits to will, and that is bracketed out of this discussion. You guys, there's no discussion of like why would the Soviet Union have been so weak other than an ideological problem. Like this, that, and the other. This is treated weirdly. Okay. So we have historically, the U.S. sees itself to be the logical conclusion and peak of Western civilization. It presented in terms of the manifest destiny of America, and then in terms of the Monroe Doctrine, and now speaks in terms of enforcement of universal human rights norms, the promotion of democracy, technology, free market institutions, and so on. No, we don't. I mean, we did when this was written, but we don't now.
Yeah, that's true.
We are simply dealing with an updated version and continuation of Western universalism passed down from the Roman Empire, medieval Christianity, modernity. Yeah, but you like medieval Christianity, Dugin. So this is where I really do get really frustrated with him, because this is irrationalist, not because it's stupid. That when people misread me as when I say Dugin's irrationalist, they think I'm saying he's dumb. He's not dumb at all. It's irrationalist, and like he literally wants things that he also contradicts in the same book. Like he wants like a civilizational norm. He wants past missions. He wants Christianity, but I don't want a universalizing Christianity. Well, what the fuck? Like Christianity, last time I checked, is inherently a universalizing doctrine.
Absolutely.
Up to the present day phenomenon of postmodernism and the fact that he called it postmodernism attempt to colonize people is pretty fucking hilarious. History is considered to be univocal and a monotone process of technological and social progress. By postmodernist, it is. Really? That's one of the things that postmodernism unequivocally rejects.
Yeah, right on the label.
The path of global liberation of individuals of all kinds of collective identities. Tradition and conservatism are thus regarded as obstacles to freedom and should be rejected. The U.S. is the vanguard of historical project and has the right, obligation, and historical mission to move further and further along the path. The historical existence of the U.S. coincides with the course of human history. Thus, American means universal. Other cultures are either have an American future or no future at all. I mean, we inherited that from the British, but sure. Politically important trends. Celebration of Heart and Negri.
I thought that was weird.
I mean, I do think it actually tells you somewhere where that left populism actually goes. There remains some distance between liberal, ultra-individual, and properly postmodernist posthumanism, promoting cybernetics, genetic modification, cloning, and chimeras. Again, this is Alex Jones shit.
He was freaked out by Dolly the sheep too.
Yeah. Political expert Stephen Mann, who affirmed that democracy can work as a self-generating virus, strengthening existing historically right democratic societies, but destroying and causing traditional societies that are not prepared for it to descend into chaos. So democracy is thought to be an effective weapon to create chaos and govern the dissipating world cultures from the core. See the Arab Spring. Which I think this is I don't know how you cannot read that as like not only not progressive, but literally we want to freeze these societies where they're at right now. Which is weird because he also wants a politics that doesn't exist yet. See what I mean by the contradictions of this book?
Absolutely.
There's a tendency for U.S. to link ideology and politics in their relations with the periphery. In earlier times, U.S. foreign policy acted on the basis of pure pragmatic realism. If regimes were pro-American, they were tolerated without regard for their ideological principles. The long-standing U.S.-Saudi Arabian alliance represents the perfect example of this. That's true.
Yeah, sure.
That's correct. Yeah. Accurate. Yeah. So people who don't say don't ever give Dugin credit for stating both what is true and obvious. Some features of this schizophrenic and dual morality are ideologically accepted. However, and recently the U.S. has begun to try to deepen its promotion of democracy, support popular revolts in Egypt and Tunisia. No, they fucking didn't.
No, they were scared to shit by it, man.
Yeah, they played both sides. When in fact their leaders were trusted allies as well as corrupt dictators. The double standard in U.S.'s political ideology was slowly vanishing and deepening the promotion of democracy processes. I mean, he should just be honest and say what he's talking about here. He's not talking about U.S. and Tunisia. He's talking about Libya.
Right. Well, and Syria.
And Libya happened yet? No, it hadn't. So no. Actually,
but he references the Arab Spring, but wasn't this written in 2000 or like 99 or 2000?
No, this was written in 2009 and published in English in 2011.
They must have added that.
They had to add shit to this because I'm like, how in the fuck is he okay, let me look at when this was originally published in Russian.
But yeah, because prior to this, references to like manipulative kind of behind the scenes color revolutions would be like Serbia and
Georgia. Had Georgia happened? Yeah, Georgia had happened. The first Ukraine color revolution, right? In 2006.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this has actually been updated. This was published in 2009. And they had to add this. There's no way this is in the original text.
Yeah, because Arab Spring was 2011, right?
Right. That would have been he's writing before this would have been published, and he would have been writing if this has not been added in later editions, even when this was still new, like when it wasn't actually clear what we were going to do about the Arab Spring. Economically, the U.S. economy is challenged by Chinese growth, energy security and scarcity, crippling debt and huge deficits, and the critical divergence and disproportion between the financial sector and the zone of industry. Yes, however, I mean, that's true. The one thing I'll tell you is nobody, however, is going to have an industrial output like even China doesn't the way it did in the 80s. Like, it's just not possible now. The work of Phil Neal makes that very clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chinese political economy is trying to reestablish its independence from U.S. global hegemony and may be a major factor of economic competition.
Well, that bear it out, sure.
Yeah,
that's true. And that's because, well, if this has been updated in 2011, that's because this is when the Belt and Road Initiative really began.
Yeah, that's true.
And that was what it was. I mean, it was an attempt not to break. I mean, China wasn't trying to break from the United States. It was just trying to give other people other options to being dependent on it.
And try to soak up some of its surplus capital.
Yeah, I was about to say, and get rid of its overproduction.
Yeah.
It has been asserted that the U.S. is the main and asymmetric actor in the center of the present state of world affairs. That was definitely true until very recently, and still kind of true. But one of the things, like, you know, one of my popular things is me pointing out that, like, part of the reason why I think the U.S. is so mealy-mouthed about Israel is they're afraid that if they actually really, really push not supporting Israel, that Israel would pursue the war without U.S. support anyway. And I know that is an unpopular opinion, and I know that would cause major problems to the Israeli economy fairly quickly, but they have 29 nukes, man.
Yeah.
Like, they don't actually need all our bombs. Like, in this case, the American order will be an American imperial order based on unipolar geopolitics. At least theoretically, it has one redeeming point: it is clear and honest about its goals and intentions. Multilateralists are more cautious and insist on the necessity of inviting other regional powers to share the burden of global hegemony with the U.S., which, honestly, that's what Putin says he wants.
Yeah. He says the United States is still the top dog, but in regional areas like the Ruski Mir and in China, you know, South Asia, that other, you know, sub-hegemon should have an ability to police and to set the terms of trade and things of that sort.
In terms of bourgeois politics, I actually think the multilateralist approach is the accurate one to do. It's not what we should be wanting as socialists necessarily.
Well, but some people get confused on that, though.
Yeah, I mean, when I say stuff like you know, we need to taunt with China and stuff like, I believe that parts of the CPC are sincerely socialist. I am not saying that somehow China is outside of the global capitalism, and pretending that it is fucking ludicrous.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is why someone like Mark Fisher talked about the slow cancellation of the future. It's like, this is what is. So whatever we can imagine is only based on this and not anything else. There's no future to define our terms. So multipolarity is, like you said, the best that bourgeois society can do. That's the best we can think of.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
My response to Mark Fisher is, well, if you're so worried about being canceled, you should have made a new one. So, anyway.
I mean, you know, fair enough. I think he's got some points, but yeah, fair enough.
No, it's not even his point. It's actually some post-autonomous Italian that he was ripping off. But anyway, so the transition question is American-centric by nature. Yeah, of course. But, like, the transition question for Russia would be Russia-centric by nature, too. Like, I don't, like, I see what he's saying here. And I the thing is, when I read this, other than I'm going to ignore the political reasons why there's these three visions that are competing and sometimes merging in this. Other than that, I was like, yeah, sure, this is mostly true. Like,
well, I mean, the transition state of world affairs would not be Russian-centric, no matter what, because it would be American-centric. At least that's what I'm reading it as saying something specifically about how the U.S. dominates the world.
Right, but if let's say we had a multipolar order, the view from Russia would still be Russian-centric. The view from America would still be American-centric.
Okay.
And it would be foolish to think otherwise.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like, and I all think we have major problems called fucking climate change bearing down on us. It's going to make all of this harder.
Absolutely.
Anyway, the American-centric world perspective described above, despite being the most important and central global tendency, is not the only possible one. I mean, I agree. There are alternative visions of the world political architecture that to be taken into consideration. There are secondary and tertiary actors that are inevitable users in the case of sets of American strategies. As countries, states, peoples, and cultures that would lose everything, including their own identity, and gain nothing if the U.S. realizes global aspirations. They are both multiple and heterogeneous and can be grouped into several different categories. Okay, let's see what the categories are, though. The first category is composed of more or less successful nations that are not happy to lose their independence and a supernatural exterior authority, not in the form of open American hegemony, nor in the even Western-centric forms of world governance, nor in the chaotic dissolution of failed international systems. There are many most countries. Among them are China, Russia, Iran, and India. BRICS plus Iran. And this includes many South American and Islamic states, although I'm not going to say which ones.
Many.
And maybe Cuba, but not for the reasons. They do not like this transition at all, suspecting with good reasons the inevitable loss of their sovereignty. I'm not sure that was true for China, actually. Among the among the groups of nations that succeed to preserve their sovereignty in face of Western hegemonic and global strategies are those who try to adopt their societies to Western standards and to keep friendly relations with the U.S. and the United States, but avoid direct and total de-sovereignization. And this includes India, Turkey, Brazil, and up to a certain point, Russia and Kazakhstan. Well, that was true for Russia until recently. Those states that are ready to cooperate with the U.S., but under the conditions of non-interference in their domestic affairs, such as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which we are mostly happy to give.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah.
Those states, while cooperating with the U.S., strictly observe the uniqueness of their society by filtering out elements of Western culture that are compatible with their domestic culture for those which are not. And at times trying to use the dividends received by this cooperation to strengthen their national independence, such as China and at times Russia. I think that's true for China's strategy, but also China, like, this pretends that China is not trying to be communist, so which is interesting. And those who try to oppose the U.S. directly, rejecting Western values. Venezuela does not reject Western values.
Yeah, not at all.
Not in the slightest.
It is shut out of Western markets, like, and also, frankly, over-relied on its oil sector for everything.
I mean, it's a Bolivarian revolution, right?
Right. I mean, that's ridiculous. Iran kind of does.
Except it's a republic.
Right.
On paper, anyway.
And North Korea kind of does, but it's not like North Korea wants to return to traditional Choson Confucian kingships.
Yeah, I kind of wonder about this last point here where he says, he talks about something which is real. And then he grabs onto it, the rejecting Western values. Now, is that because he sees making this point is in service of some larger point later? Or is it just...
I suspect that's what it is, yeah. That's a good point.
It's either that or it's just very clumsy wording, which I think he's clever enough to not just be clumsy at wording. So I think there's this argument is going to develop as
he wants to conflate things, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think... well, again, if you make it about Western values, you don't have to talk about material reasons why it's happening.
Right.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Like, only one of those people explicitly rejected the U.S. as such, not just U.S. imperialism, and that is Iran. I guess maybe the DPRK, but the DPRK, like, that's a more complicated question, honestly. Yeah. It's not, the DPRK is not even like clear on terms of like normal communist versus non-communist stuff, because there's some particular things about Jusei that the current defenders of North Korea just don't want to deal with. And that North Korea is no longer rejecting, is no longer trying to be autarkic like it was in this time period.
Right.
Kim Jong-un has liberalized just with only states that he can liberalize towards, which is basically Cuba, Russia, and China.
Yep.
Anyway. But I mean, he is talking about like the axis of evil. So
yeah, right.
The axis of evil plus Venezuela, and I mean, we're not going to get into Venezuela. I mean, right now you're in this weird thing where those nations are the nations who are responding to Venezuela, but Latin American left nations are not. And in fact, like Brazil seems to be the counterforce to Venezuela right now, and that's also a left government. So. It's all weird. The second category of actors who reject transitions consisting of subnational groups, movements, and organizations that oppose American dominance of structures of global geopolitical arrangement for ideological, religious, or cultural reasons.
Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, this is the jihad versus Macworld thesis, but like for reactionaries. Which also, the jihad versus Macworld thesis was for reactionaries then too, just American ones. Anyway, the most recognized form of this is the Islamicist world vision, which aspires towards a utopia of an individual state based on strict interpretation of Islamic law, our universal caliphate, which brings the entire world under Islamic rule. I see. While Dugin is concessionary towards Islamism, he actually really, really stands against stuff like ISIS and the Universal Caliphate because it's against Russian interest. Just want to point
and also
that
because that project for ISIS and anybody like that, the Salafist Wahhabist vision is universal. It's not
absolutely.
It's not like civilizational. You can't like leave it at the door whenever you cross into Russia or into the West or whatever. It's like you're trying to bring it with you, and that's a problem for Dugin.
Yeah.
And whatever. Yeah.
No, you're right.
So then you have projects of transnational neo-socialists represented by the South American left and the Pink Wave plus Hugo Chavez. I guess was Hugo Chavez still around when this book was written? I believe so.
Yeah, I think he died in 2013.
I think
13. Yeah, so even if they had updated this, he was still alive.
Yeah. So the CIA hit him with the cancer gun.
Shush. I'm not touching that. And he talks about like the hybrid regimes of Gaddafi here. Which was like Arab left pan-Arabism, basically.
Yeah.
And then the third example, of course, is his favorite, which is Eurasian multipolarity.
There we go.
These are not an all-inclusive list of non-state actors and theories of alternative visions of world order. There are many others. And, this was this vision presented by a lot of people, by everybody versus the center. All right, we've done chapter 5. We've been going for an hour and a half. So we can make a call on chapter 6. It involves Deleuze.
Yay!
And
some of your besties are implicated.
And we finally get Guanan and Avola mentioned explicitly.
Nice.
But I have a strange feeling that this is going to be beyond our ability to cover in the next hour. So maybe we stop here.
Yeah,
even though we only talked about the book for an hour of our conversation.
But we had some great sidebars, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I am impressed at the eclecticism of this. I mean, people think that we're just coming down on this. I don't want to praise this book because I do think it's basically post-fascist. But I don't want to say that there's no truth in here. And in fact, treating this as if it's all nonsense actually is part of how it got empowered. Because it's clearly not all nonsense. Like, it's not. The critique of American hegemony is valid. It's actually, I think we're in a different moment right now, because when we talk about the factions of the blob, like the Peter Zion faction has said the blob is giving up on ruling the world, that it's actually totally okay with multipolarity. It just wants to set the terms of multipolarity. That's what Peter Zion says. So does Mersheimer, but he wants it on different terms, completely different terms. Both are hostile to China, but Zion says, and Zion's more where the Democrats are, let China's demographic crisis handle itself.
Right.
That they're going to lose several million people from just old age. Just don't do anything. And which is not what I would do. I would say, like, we need to start repairing the relation, like if I was and again, I'm not saying this as socialist Varn. I'm saying this as
realpolitik,
yeah,
bourgeois politics, Varn.
right.
Yeah.
That we would just accept, which we would realize that we could easily fall into a Thucydides trap, and just go, I don't want to step in the Thucydides trap. That destroys both sides usually, but definitely the old power definitely usually loses.
Mm-hmm.
So if they give us an olive branch, fucking take it and respect them as equals, right? Because we have bigger shit on our plate. I don't know, like climate change and energy problems and transitions to more stable currencies, etc.
But that's the real scary thing about what's happening right now, isn't it?
Right.
That like these people around dinner tables and quiet conversations will acknowledge these threats as like the greater threats, but there's something imminent about the world system of sovereign nation states and the declining hegemonic order, that exists, that's still leading to something that looks like a Thucydides trap or something that looks like a chaotic unwinding, despite the knowledge of of our ruling classes. And it's really frightening to watch these overweening structures like move things in these directions, despite all the rhetoric in like the liberal press about what's necessary for climate change. The most glaring example, of course, is the solar panel and electric vehicle glut in China. The overproduction, quote unquote, of those things, which is like a perfect win-win situation, of course, for capital. International capital would be to like solve this green energy transition by like dumping these things on the world market, by having free trade and that stuff, by doing comparative advantage, and basically like using the means of production to get us out of this mess while profits are made at the same time. But the nation state and national interest, quote unquote, stand in between these things. Deeply irrational, more irrational than anything that Dugin could come up with.
Well,
that's why the Sorcerer's Apprentice imagery is so useful, I think.
Right. Well, here's the other thing we have to be also very honest about. Marxists tend to talk about the bourgeoisie as if they're unified, and they're only unified against labor.
Yeah.
They're not unified anywhere else. Like, their major competitors are themselves.
Yeah.
And their different sectors.
Yeah. And different nation states representatives of capital.
Right. But the problem that, this is an old problem, but this is a problem Marx recognized. Capitalism was always global. It comes out of burgerism, which is merchants and pirates.
Yeah.
Necessarily multi-polity. Right. But they needed stable national currencies and currency zones, which you need nations to build to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that fundamental paradox is a paradox that I don't think Marxists deal with enough, honestly. They're like, capital is global, but the administration of capitalism requires basically national zones to do and to set up the markets and maintain them.
Even to have laissez-faire, you needed a strong state.
Right.
Especially to have laissez-faire.
Especially to have
I gotta be honest, man. Like, typically Marxists lately, and when I say lately, I mean in my lifetime, don't really deal with anything. But it's really, really fucking frustrating.
Well, I mean, they're usually basically I'm not even gonna say campus, because like that would imply they're camps, right? Like,
they're sloganeers of empty signifiers.
Usually of foreign policy, are of not even socialist domestic reforms. Like, and we've gone through these wild. I have a friend of mine who's like, "Oh, you were mad at them for not listening to foreign policy, but now you're really annoyed by the way the anti-imperialists are handling it." And I'm making fun of this guy because he really deserves it on this point. And I'm basically like, I didn't want you to run wildly from domestic politics that weren't socialist to pretending that you could protest your way out of fucking multinational wars.
Right.
Like, that's fucking stupid. And if your anti-imperialism is like, oh, we're going to have another protest, who cares?
Yeah,
We're seeing
cares.
the fruits of that in Chicago right now, and it's really blackpilling and depressing, to be quite honest.
Well, it's like the opposite. This is literally. I was joking this morning, and I was like, funnily enough, this is all ending as both the opposite of 1968 and the opposite of 2008, in that we have decided, from the standpoint of the other side, and I say we, I mean a lot of the left, not all of it, to jump on the liberals who have decided to, because they were able to avoid the contestation of a primary and thus look at the fractures within liberalism, could just huff the paint fumes of a cipher. Now, I also want to point out that I don't think the primary process is actually particularly democratic, but beyond that, to get a unity that is based off of, and to get thrown some change in a way that actually exposed some things to some people. For example, even the fucking normal AOC defenders have now come on, like, that I was right about AOC. And by the way, I was critiquing the AOC shit before Jimmy Dore was. Because it's very clear to me, and it has been very clear to me since 2018, that AOC was going to go the same way as Nancy Pelosi did in the 80s.
She is the new Nancy Pelosi.
Right.
Someday Speaker of the House.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
Well, she's also in a safe enough district, let's be quite honest. But the other thing that we saw is the DSA claiming victory over getting Biden to leave or getting Harris to pick Walz. I mean, Walz is fine. I mean, as far as, like, Walz is an interesting choice in that he's actually not an elite. I mean, he is an elite by election, but he, like, doesn't even own his own fucking house. He's been a farmer his whole life.
Yeah.
And he does actually seem to be relatively actually progressive compared to, like, most of the old white guys you drag out of the gubernatorial.
I mean, compared to Harris, he's progressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, compared to, honestly, he's not that different from Bernie.
No, he really isn't.
But I actually think that's a condemnation of Bernie, not of Walsh. So it's, anyway, my point in all this is, like, it seems to me like for all the radicalization of Gen Z, which I didn't believe in the first place, it seems
I was going to say, what radicalization?
No, it seems like the stats actually suppose that most Gen Z are relatively unpolitical compared to millennials of the same age, at the same time period, which we should kind of expect, because what did they see from all the millennial radicalization? Cringe and delusion and mental unwellness,
and
like,
cope.
A
lot of cope.
But the problem is, it's not like there's a normal that we can go back to.
Right.
Like, so a cipher works, right? So I just feel like, okay, so it was Obama's failure to deal with economic crisis that made Marxism back on the map. And yet we are seeing people from a less hope and less change candidate get in on the hope and change, politics of joy, vibes bullshit.
Brad Summer bullshit.
Immediately, as soon as they could. Like, and in a way that's, like, impressive, even though it's totally empty. And they're taking a few symbolic bones as major victories, although even a lot of the DSA, and I mean not just the left of the DSA, I mean the DSA right, has been like, oh shit, like, this AOC stuff may not have gone this way. But they're also trying to claim victory for Harris while their own candidates that were weak are being defeated. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Just being rammed to the ground.
Somehow that's a vindication of their project. Yeah.
So, I mean, if I was Dugin, I wouldn't be trying to convince, trying to get a bunch of people to destroy America. I would just be sitting back and
watching. Absolutely. While Papa Putin does the job in reality.
Right. Well, I mean, and, like, Putin's not really destroying America either. Like,
no, but he's had a world historical task placed upon himself that he didn't even realize. But one thing that you can say about Putin is he took his vulgar Marxist-Leninist education seriously, because he thinks deeply and strategically about the future in a way that American planners, except maybe the U.S. military, doesn't. So
I don't know about that. Who's his successor?
His successor, Medvedev, that scary psychopath. I don't know. No, he does think, he thinks in world historic terms. He thinks in civilizational terms in a way that that others don't.
I think that's right. I think
vulgarized.
There's some obvious places where there's an inadequacy, like Varn just talked about. But I think in general, I think you're right.
But he's just also a reactionary at the same time. So there's no positive that comes out of that.
I mean, I think what we have to look is what's China going to do and what's the U.S. going to do now that China has major ports, well, not military ports, but major commercial ports that it owns.
How about the Western ruling class lets the demographic crisis fix itself? The Eastern ruling classes let the American political chaos sort itself out. And then fucking hopefully we'll all end up like fading off into the sunset and something new can come in 10, 15, 20 years.
Except that you're forgetting that India is a thing.
Yeah. Well, and also
that forgets a lot of things. My little provocation there forgets.
There's also the case of the ruling classes can't actually wait for anything because they have to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. That's,
and in the West, they're running out of
profit.
In the West, they're running out of ways of doing it all, and in China, they're running out of ways to do it easily.
Yeah.
And so it's
the future might appear to be on Duginist terms, but as always, the future will sort itself out in material.
Well, I mean, I also think it's becoming very clear to people that multipolarity doesn't really mean much because they already live in it. Like it's just it's like. You it's already like are there.
It's like a fish calling for an oxygen-rich water environment.
Right. It's just like it's like you're already there. What are you gonna do about it? That's been my whole point about multipolarity this whole time. It's not that like I'm against people like, oh, you're against multipolarity. I'm like, that's like me being against water.
It's like being against thunderstorms. Like I don't yes, fine, it's gonna rain, but now what?
Yeah, it's like, what are we gonna do about it? Like, what does it mean? And, like we can play the blame game or the morality game about what Russia did in Ukraine, which I actually do think, like in terms of international principles, is not that different than what the U.S. did in Iraq, and I mean that as both a condemnation and a recognition of reality.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with one slight caveat. I think it's well, no, whatever. You're right.
Well, I also think if they actually win, there's going to be a bigger problem of an insurgency that's not going to go away.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Depending on how much they try to take, but yeah.
Right. If it depends on if there's a hubristic moment or not of driving further west. And if there is, then you will have an insurgency. And even if you get rid of the current government, if you and that's the truth of modern. That's one of the reasons we avoid war. Is war, ironically, has been relatively democratized. See the fucking Houthi all of a sudden.
Yeah. Like, but then also de-democratized with the end of the draft and conscription in the West. It's become professionalized and democratized at the same time. Right. Depending on whether you're a state actor or a parastate actor.
Right. Yeah. Parastate actors can act now in a way that they couldn't in the 20th century. But war has been totally de-democratized as a state form. You're absolutely right. And and you want to make leftists uncomfortable, you do what I do and talk about, if you want to get rid of the cops and the military, fine. Universal conscription for both security services, both internal and external. And I actually do think that's the proper communist answer, by the way.
I do too. Yes.
So do
people's militias, workers' militias, even better.
And that the amount of pushback I get when I say that out loud from the very same people who used to talk about police abolition have all of a sudden shut the fuck up about it. They do not like that.
Let's keep being clarifiers, all of us. Let's take people's positions to their logical conclusions.
Yeah, that's the surest way to find out whether or not anybody actually believes anything.
Right. Are you willing to sacrifice something think.
Or even believe that society exists and it's something that
Right.
people should take conscious control over and be accountable to the broad masses of people. I gotta run, fellas.
Yeah, right.
I hate to say it. You guys can continue if you want, but
we should head on out.
Yeah, let's head out.
Matt, good evening, listeners, since we've been off topic for a good 15 minutes anyway.
They love it.
And have a good rest of your day.